I'm going to do another quote from your book because I like some of these a lot. I know now that there's no such thing as a good person or bad person. Instead, we are all shades of gray. It's our choices that lead us to one side or the other. Every single person is both a hero and a deeply flawed individual. Each day we are tested and given a chance to start fresh, to right wrongs from the past, to possibly be the hero in someone's story. Each person, no matter how small, has an integral part to play in the stories of the lives of people around them. I hope to make the choices that will lead myself and everyone I encounter to the light instead of the darkness. And I think this is a really profound thing to understand. None of us are perfect just because we're in the helping profession or a helping profession. But we all have this desire to help and heal people while also being imperfect people ourselves. How do you think we kind of move forward with that understanding to better help our patients?
Well, this is actually twofold. So the first part is what we've kind of talked about, which is having a little bit of grace for people who are under pressure or maybe having a bad day and being able to say, okay, that's not about me, that's about them, and let that go. But the other piece of that too is having grace for yourself, that I am a flawed person. Yeah, I've made mistakes, but I don't have to go over it again and again in my mind about how, bad I messed this thing up or messed that thing up. Really, I learned from it. Did I take something away from it? Did I become a better person from it? Yes, I did, because I'm going to move forward positively instead of staying in that kind of that wheel where you just keep thinking about it and you can't sleep at night because you're constantly running it over in your head of how you could have done things differently. We have to forgive ourselves just as much as we have to be able to forgive others, for our own mental health and to make sure that we positively move forward. And that's what I think emergency management has taught me is for every call, we do an after action. And I think in paramedicine, you do that as well, but we do it more, I think, in emergency management, where we really walk through what worked, what didn't work, what would we do different in the future. We learn those lessons, and then really we let go of that stuff from there. We learn the lesson, we take the lesson forward, but I'm no longer going to worry about the fact that things weren't perfect on this call. And the same thing goes for my mistakes from the past. In my 20s, it is a miracle I survived my 20s. But everything that I did in my 20s led me to who I am today. So would I change it? I really don't think I would, because I'd be a different person. So we have to be able to accept that we make those mistakes, and that as long as we're learning from it and moving forward, then it's a positive thing.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think all of us have dealt with getting stuck in that wheel of like blaming ourselves for an outcome, or I didn't get that tube quite quickly enough, or I didn't see the proper differential on this scene and I looked like an idiot in front of the doctor, or I mean, we all make so many mistakes. We see thousands of patients. You're not going to perform perfectly on each one. And even in the ER as a PA, it's the same thing. We don't do a perfect job every time. And I think if you get stuck in that wheel going home at night and just thinking about that call or that patient over and over again, you're not going to move forward, and it's going to potentially impact your next patient if you can't move on from that last mistake you made. I think that's a great point.
Yeah, and I don't think that we do a good enough job in our field of talking about trauma and how it does impact us, and how each of these decisions we make and each mistake that we may make kind of impacts our psyche. And so part of the reason for this book too was just to kind of open up that conversation and say, be a little bit vulnerable in there, because I do share some stuff in there that is pretty, vulnerable. But it was also just to say it's okay to not be okay sometimes, and as long as you have kind of this awareness that everybody else is kind of working through stuff too. Everybody's got their stuff that you may or may not know about. And they're all trying to work through this life, and everybody's dealt a bad hand at some point. But if we can't talk about trauma in a very honest way in our field, it does lead to burnout, and it does lead to mental health disorders that could have been prevented if people were able to be just a little bit more open about what's going on with them. So I wanted to that was kind of part of the reason for the book too, was to show others in this field that maybe it's okay to talk about this stuff, and to seek help when you need help. Because, I've had some friends who committed suicide along the way because they were in a place where nobody knew that they were there. They just never shared it with anybody. So that's a big part of this book as well.
Yeah, I think making that awareness a bigger deal in our field is super important. I mean, I think that historically the culture in EMS is to, we're tough, we can see anything and we can deal with it. And only in maybe the last few years that I've seen that start to shift. And especially as I've had conversations with people like you that are vulnerable and like this job is not easy. We see things that humans are not supposed to see, right? And so you have to be better at healing from it than the average person in the average population. I mean, we just see horrible stuff, and we're not supposed to just, we're not a brick wall. Like we all are impacted by it. Even if you kind of don't feel like it in the moment, you probably will be when you think about it later. And I think that's important to recognize. Otherwise, people just aren't intentional about healing from it. And you've got to be intentional about it and recognizing it. And I think that's becoming a more and more awareness in people.
Yeah. And also understanding that everybody develops coping mechanisms for what they go through, and those could be either positive or negative. So as long as you're aware of it, then you can make sure that those coping mechanisms turn out to be more positive in your life than those that are going to cause you harm. Because we're all going to have coping mechanisms. Like one of mine that's, I think, positive is dark humor. And I think this is in EMS and emergency services all over the places. That's a coping mechanism that I think whenever a crew had a really bad call, we always got together as multiple crews to have a meal. And we didn't really necessarily talk about the call, but it was really about the camaraderie and then the laughter that came from it. And it eased some of the tension, the stress. And then if they did want to talk about the call, they could. But otherwise, it was really just trying to get together to show them they have the support that they need, and to laugh about, life and the things that we kind of go through.
Yeah, I think that dark sense of humor is, I mean, it's pretty much everybody in emergency services, even in the ER. I mean, we see it a ton. And part of it, I think, helps us compartmentalize so we can move on. We can laugh about something ridiculous and you can move on to run that next call. And maybe we talk about it later. Maybe we don't. Maybe we debrief later. Maybe we don't. But it does allow us to move on. And you make a great point about coping strategies. Like, regardless of if they're good or bad, you're going to develop them one way or the other. And it's important to I think just being intentional, like, if you have a bad day and you go home and drink, you've got to recognize that's your coping strategy. And it's probably going to make you feel good for a couple hours, but it's probably not going to make you feel good the next day. And so you got to recognize that you're kind of doing that to yourself, and recognize maybe I should go for a walk outside, get some sun on my skin after that. Maybe that's the better, strategy in this situation. But yeah, I think it's being intentional about what you're doing to help yourself, and whether it's an overall negative or a positive, I think just being intentional about that is super key.
Yeah, I think a good example of that is when I developed some coping mechanisms from my childhood because of my dad's alcoholism. And one of those is hypervigilance. And so I'm always looking out for the bad, right? What's bottom is gonna fall out? What's the next thing that's gonna come my way? But in a way, that designed me perfectly for paramedicine and then also for emergency management, because my job now is ultimately to figure out what bad is going to happen and to plan for it so that we're ready for it. But also, I think that hypervigilance caused me to also see the good, because I'm always looking around and I'm seeing something that people may not see normally because I'm constantly scanning, right? So in a way, I kind of think that that hypervigilance allowed me to also see the wildfire sunset, or I can see the kid and how he's been positively impacted by somebody who said something kind to him when he's on a bad call or his parents are injured or something, right? So that's, I think, a coping mechanism that could be very bad, but it also has these positive traits to it, with hypervigilance. And I think it lends itself well to a career in emergency medicine, right?
Yeah, I think that hypervigilance and you kind of framing yourself as a watcher is like a next level skill, because I think you pick up on cues that maybe a lot of people probably don't. You probably see that patient that's getting a little agitated and maybe they're all of a sudden going to be violent, and you can kind of see that and try to de-escalate it before it comes to a head and they actually are violent. But I think a lot of people without experience don't see those cues before they happen, and it can make them get blindsided by certain things, or even a patient that's going to crash soon. If you can pick up on those cues, they're usually there, but we just may not notice them if you're not being hypervigilant in certain situations, or if you haven't had the experience of seeing a bunch of patients crash, you don't know exactly what you're looking at. I see that with new nurses a lot too. Like, hey, this patient doesn't look quite right. Can you come in and just reassess them? And sometimes they just need some reassurance. Like, no, I think this patient's fine. But I always encourage them to bring that to me whenever they're concerned. I want to go look at this patient. And I try to tell the other providers too, like if a nurse is coming to you with a concern, you need to get off your ass and go look at the patient again, because they're in there more than we are as providers. They're at the bedside giving meds and talking with the patient a lot more than we are. And they're going to pick up on subtle cues a lot of times more than we are because they're at the bedside. And so I always take it seriously. And sometimes the newer nurses just need some reassurance, like, no, this patient's fine. We're going to keep reassessing them. And sometimes you walk in and you're like, holy shit, I'm really glad you grabbed me, because this patient is, decompensating significantly. So I always take their complaints seriously.
Yeah, and I would say that I would much rather go into a room and say, "Oh, okay, no, everything's fine. I think we're good," than to not get the call because they don't trust you or you've snapped at them one too many times and then something goes bad with the patient. I'd rather just have the false call than have the missed call.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's about having good relationship with your coworkers too, so they trust you to, if your EMT partner doesn't trust you, or they're hesitant to say, hey, this patient is looking a little different than when we first started transport. Can we just pull over and have you look at him? If they don't trust you enough to do that, it's going to lead to bad patient outcomes.
Yeah, absolutely.
You touch on another really big point that I talk about a lot on the podcast, and that's the balance between having compassion for a patient and, you word it this way, carrying the burden of another's troubles for them. How do you think we find this balance?
Well, I think that's very hard because again, we're helpers and we want to help people. But I also think, how can you best help somebody? Is it that you do something for them, or is it that you help walk them through how to do it themselves, right? So I have a reputation in my work as an emergency manager of, with my staff, I throw them off the cliff. So I love to let people fail a little bit. I mean, I'm always there to catch them, but I want to teach people through experience, right? And so I did this a little bit as a paramedic when I was a training instructor, but it's easier as an emergency manager. And now that I have a little bit more experience, I hire people that are pretty new, but in that though, I allow them to make some decisions. I allow them to try some new things. Some things work, some things don't. I allow them to innovate a little bit, but in doing that, it's better than me. And they're going to learn that better than if I told them, here's how I would do it. Plus, it gives their little stamp on it, right? Of how they would do the job, because everybody does things a little bit different. Everybody has a different personality. So I do tend to think that that goes to the compassion too, of if somebody's really kind of hurting and they come to you, I want to ensure that I'm compassionate enough and that I'm aware enough about what's going on to know when do they need help and when do they just need somebody to listen. Because it's not always about solving the person's problem, right? Sometimes it's just being about an ear that they need to just talk to. And that's what therapy is all about, is it's just somebody that's there to listen to you as you process your own thoughts and your own feelings. And sometimes I'm like, I pay a therapist. I could pay somebody 50 cents and have them drink a coffee and get the same outcome, but that's not actually true. But in a way, it's just having somebody there who you can kind of bounce some ideas off of. So I do think that that's where the compassion comes in, is knowing when you should step in and assist them versus when you should be the ear, and then when you should provide some level of support, but allow them to do the thing on their own, right? So, and everybody's a little bit different. Every situation's a little bit different. You have to decide in that moment which one's going to be best, but just knowing that you don't have to solve people's problems for them. And in many ways, it's better for them to kind of work it through and solve it on their own with your support.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think especially when we're, as a paramedic, you get paramedic students all the time. I mean, whether you really want them or not, I feel like all of us who are paramedics have trained new paramedics at one point or another. And that's probably helped you moving into emergency management, because we do have to kind of step back and let these brand new paramedics do some of these skills, standing over their shoulder, like ready to intervene if we have to, but we have to let go of the reins a little bit or they're not going to learn to do this. And I don't want them to be intubating for the first time all by themselves with no support. I want them to do it where I can jump in and get the tube if I have to. But that's really hard to do. Like, you want to do it yourself. It's so hard to stand back and watch them fumble through something, but that's the only way they're going to learn it. And so
they might do it just different than you do too, but it doesn't make it wrong. And that's a very hard thing too, to step back and be like, I don't know if I would have done that way.
No, that's a great point. Especially when, I mean, there's so many calls where if there's multiple paramedics on scene, they all have this different idea of how to run the call. They all have this different idea of what's going on, and none of them are necessarily incorrect. I mean, maybe there is one ultimate diagnosis, but there's a lot of right ways to treat patients. There's a lot of correct plans, and as long as everybody's taking the patient seriously, there is a lot of right ways. And I think a lot of paramedics don't understand that, and they get really angry on scene when the paramedic that's leading the call doesn't lead it exactly how they would. Because I see that in the ER too. Paramedics will be like, I can't believe the fire department gave aspirin to this patient. I would have never given him aspirin. I'm like, did it harm the patient though? Is it really anything that makes a big difference? Like, don't stress about it so much. It's not that big of a deal. Of course there's some things that are totally wrong. But a lot of the issues I see are not ones that are a very big deal that need to be worried about.
And that's where you're there as a support system. This could be for an individual as well as a partner, where you're there as a support system so that they can do what they need to do and learn what they need to learn in their own way. But then if something is going to go off the rails, you stop it and you say, okay, this is where I step in and I do something. And you're there to make sure that they don't get themselves into trouble or get the patient into trouble. The same thing for emergency management. I don't allow these folks to just fail and flail along the floor and say, oh, look at them, they couldn't figure this out. I allow them to try some stuff, fail a little bit, figure it out along the way, learn some stuff, and then provide some support here and there to get them on the right path. But then along the way, they learned so much stuff because they tried some stuff that didn't work, and now they know that, and they're never going to forget it. I had an employee once who made a very bad judgment. He was an error with it wasn't like life or death or anything. This was more of um, personalities and working with others. And he made a judgment call that was extreme. And so the people called me and they said, we want him fired. And I wasn't going to fire him over this one thing, but he came in thinking he was going to be fired when he came into my office. And so he's like, I would totally understand it if you fire me. And I said, well, let me ask you this, what did you learn from this? And are you ever going to forget it? And he's like, no, I'm never going to forget this. This is with me forever. And I said, so why would I bring in somebody new who doesn't have that lesson, who's probably going to do the same thing along the line when you are never going to do this thing again? He said, yeah, you're right. I will never do that thing again.
Yeah, that's huge. And I think that's why EMS, like when they do these case reviews, they've moved away from it being like this punitive thing, like you're in trouble because you messed up this call. Like we're all doing our best, you know what I mean? It's not, nobody's willfully making errors or bad judgment calls, but we kind of have to be allowed to make them. And I think it's better when it's not punitive because now you're a better paramedic. Now you've learned that you're not going to make that mistake again. It's stuck in your brain forever. We all have those calls where you're like, I will never do that again. And you're a much safer paramedic from it. And so I think it's way better to not be punitive, and just learn from these things. Cause I mean, we're all in the same boat.
And we deal with so much uncertainty. There's so many calls where, we don't know really what's going on. We're going to have to be able to critically think through it, try some stuff out, see what works. And so if you don't teach that as they're going along, they're not going to learn that process, and they're not going to be as willing to say, hey, I'm not exactly sure what's happening here, but let's try this, and see if it works. And if it doesn't work, then we have, B, C, and D that we can work on from that. But it makes them more aware of and able to critically think through a complex problem,
Yeah. In one of the last chapters of your book, you talk about the last call, which I haven't really talked about a lot on the podcast. And it's kind of odd that it hasn't come up before, but most of us have heard this at some point in our career. It's that familiar voice of the dispatcher coming over the radio. I mean, I can think of multiple times in my career, I'm driving back to base or it's the end of the shift and I hear, the dispatcher we listen to all day come over the radio and they call for your dead coworker several times and there's only silence on the other end. They call for paramedic X, Y, and Z, and they do it multiple times to radio silence. And I mean, I can think of probably 3 of these that I can just think of off the top of my head over the years. And it highlights in a very unique way that person's never going to speak again or respond to another call again. It's something, for some reason, just hasn't come up on the show, but it's a super impactful thing, I think, in paramedicine. I kind of wanted to see why you chose to include that in the book.
Well, I think it's because it's a tribute really to what that person gave to the field. I think that public servants, they work in the background all day, every day for the betterment of others. And most people never see it. They don't think about it. They just know that if they call 911, somebody's going to show up, right? So I think that that last call, the reason I think it's so important, I mean, it is a thing that, you know, gets everybody in the room. I think if the rest of the funeral didn't do that, that is the piece that does. But the part about it that I think is so important is it is that final tribute to that person to acknowledge what they've done and who they are and what the gift was that they gave to the area that they served, right? And just to show everybody, and that's why I think it goes over the air. It's not something that's just done like within the funeral itself or the memorial. They do it over the radio to just show everybody and honor that person for the sacrifice that they made.
Yeah, I love that you included that. I don't think that gets brought up enough, but it's a very beautiful tribute to those people. And of course, I mean, that's one of those things that makes us all cry, right? I mean, it's so, I mean, I think it's because it's something that happens so often on shift. You hear dispatch call for your coworkers to go respond to this call and that call. And then just to hear like that lack of any response is just, boy, that really tugs at your heartstrings.
Yeah.
I was talking to a gentleman from Australia yesterday, and he told me that they don't really do that there. And he loves that we do it here. And he saw like the value in it. And he said, you know, you guys do a very good job of honoring your emergency services workers that die in the line of duty. He said, you know, you don't really see that in Australia. And I was kind of surprised by that he's noticed kind of the tributes like the overpass freeways, right, that fly the flag or have people saluting as the fire truck goes through. He's noticed that from Australia that we really honor the lives of the people that have served, and he wishes that they would do something like that in Australia.
Yeah, that's cool. I love this term that you have in here that you call the collateral beauty that you find in the aftermath of tragedy. I think that's a great term for it. Can you kind of explain what collateral beauty is?
Yeah, the reason it's collateral beauty is because it's only there because of something tragic that's happened. It's not just beauty that you see like stopping to smell the flowers or, you know, those kinds of things. It's really because of the tragedy itself, this thing has happened. So again, we need to take the time to see the collateral beauty that comes from these disasters so that we can retain our humanity in a way, right? So when you see that community comes together after a tornado, and they all start building back their community together, and they're making decisions together, and then they start having the, you know, regular barbecues or the pancake breakfast, and they get together once a year and talk about everything that they've been through. None of that would have occurred. You know, we have a community here in Colorado, Glen Haven. It's a tiny little mountain community, but the 2013 floods that we had in Colorado, which was the largest Colorado disaster that we've had, it just wiped out Glen Haven completely. And so at the time, none of those folks knew one another. You move up to the mountains because you want to be left alone most of the time. And so nobody knew how to get a hold of anybody, but they were really isolated. All the roads outside of that area were completely cut off. They had to depend upon one another in the response and then also in the recovery of trying to get those roads rebuilt. But now they have an email list. They've built a town hall. They do get together regularly to talk to one another. They have like the parties at the fire station, or they have the pancake breakfast. And all of that happened because something very tragic occurred that caused them to learn something, and they learned the value of connection from that. And now it's a very different community. So I just think that in our world, especially because we're faced with everybody's worst day, you can't let that go by and not see the collateral beauty that comes from chaos and tragedy, you know? And, you know, the most innovative time in our whole history was the 200 years after the Great Plague. So you lose half the population in England. And because of that, they had to figure out how to do things completely different. They didn't have the same amount of people. They didn't have the same systems. So they had to really innovate and figure out new things. And it created this 200 years of just innovative practices and all kinds of good stuff that we use today. So again, I'm not saying that the Great Plague was a good thing, but I am saying that there's the collateral beauty from that, though, is look at how much innovation came from that time, right?
Yeah, I love that. You end the book with a discussion about our own mortality and how you're living your life looking for the good in every day, despite the fact that you're dealing with another fairly daunting medical challenge. What advice would you have for someone that's facing similar medical challenges while working in the healthcare field or working in EMS?
Oh, that's a hard one, I guess. Well, when I first had a mass in my chest a few years ago, I really had to face the fact that I probably wasn't going to come out of surgery. So it was a very serious surgery. So I really had to do kind of that life's inventory. And what I found from that is how great it was to be able to do that life's inventory, to kind of look back and see, have I done all the things that I wanted to do? Have I lived the life that I wanted to live? And then when I came out of that surgery and the surgeon said, hey, we were able to get that mass, all of a sudden I had this clean slate where I was able to say, I have already done that life inventory and I'm pretty happy with what I've accomplished. And I was able to look back and at some stuff and say, yeah, I did those things. So then I was able to kind of from the clean slate say, what else is possible? What else can I do? Right. So I think anybody that's facing an illness, again, this comes back to what's the mindset that you go into it? And you can have the mindset of everything is bad and why me? Why is this happening? Or you can take that mindset of you stand up, you dust yourself off, you give yourself a little bit of time, because I'm not saying you don't grieve when these situations happen. You give yourself some time, but like for me, I always give myself a timeline. So if I'm really sad or if I'm grieving something, I'll tell myself, okay, I'm giving you 24 hours to wallow in it, get all that sadness out. And after 24 hours, I need to take a step forward and figure out what I'm going to do from here. Right. So, in some cases, it's knowing that you have to give yourself the opportunity to feel all the things that you need to feel. But you also have to know that at the end of the day, I have to act and I have to figure out, what do I want my life to be about? Am I going to let this define me, or am I going to just stand up and say, that's one part of me, I've got that, but I also want to make sure that I live a life that's worthy, right? Does that make sense?
Wow. Absolutely. I think that's amazing. I think not identifying with that and making it your whole personality is amazing. I think that's true for everybody. I mean, we see all these patients with chronic illnesses too, and when they choose not to identify with them and make that their entire world, I think that really helps them move and make impact like you obviously have. So I think that's amazing advice.
Yeah, and then those people too who, they have this illness and now all of a sudden they become an advocate for people with that illness, right? They create something positive from it, and then they start helping others who are also within that illness, right? So I think that there's just all kinds of ways to be positive about it.
Yeah, that's amazing. What advice would you have for paramedics that are looking to kind of further their career and go into emergency management?
I would want paramedics to know that emergency management is not emergency services. So I am an ex-firefighter paramedic who went into emergency management, but I also understand that it's a different field. It's connected, but I am not making tactical decisions. I am making strategic decisions, and I work in more of a horizontal collaborative model than a hierarchy or a top-down kind of command and control model. So I would say that if anybody is in emergency services, I think they have great value to the field of emergency management, because if you know what's going on scene, you're going to be able to figure out how best to help those folks in the field. And I don't think that there's anything that could take anything away from that. But you also have to then step out of that and say, from a broader perspective, again, taking a step back and looking at it, I'm now dealing with 100-something agencies who are all coordinating on this disaster, all for the same goal, right? But it's a collaborative approach. They don't work for me at any time. They can walk away and I have to fill that gap, right? So we have to create these systems that really work for those folks. So most of what we do is facilitation, mediation. It's working with building relationships, making sure those relationships are strong. So if people want to get into the field, they just have to know that that's what they're getting into, instead of it's a retirement job. That's what I hate. I hate when people are like, well, I'm thinking about getting out of this. I've been doing it for 20 years. And so this will be a nice retirement gig, because it's a hard job,
I deal with the same thing with the PA profession. It's paramedics that are like, oh yeah, I'll become a PA and retire. And I'm like, this is a whole other career that you really have to be gung-ho about. It's not just a stepwise thing that you can just progress to and retire. It's its own career. So I understand that. I deal with the same thing.
Yeah, and the two complement one another, definitely. Sure. And the knowledge in both of them, it definitely helps you, but they are different fields, right? So you have to treat it as such.
No, I think that's a good point. Can you explain kind of the difference between making tactical and making strategic decisions?
Yeah, so as an emergency manager, I don't make decisions about where the evacuation zones are. I don't make decisions about moving people out of an area because of flash flooding. So that's all done by law enforcement, by firefighters, by emergency medical services personnel that are in the field looking at the scene. But when they make those decisions, my job is what we call consequence management. So, for example, when a law enforcement officer makes the decision to evacuate a community, I now need to shelter that community and I need to feed them. I need to be able to give them information, figure out when they can go back home and give them those notifications. So each action taken by the field, then I have to figure out what are the ripples that are going to impact the community from that decision. And that's an emergency manager's role. So we have to look more broadly. So for example, a fire, the firefighters don't care about air quality. I mean, I'm sure that they do, but they're not caring about it when they're fighting the fire. I care about it because it's now impacting the hospital that has people who might be compromised, and so I'm now focusing in on my relationships with the hospitals, making sure they're not getting overwhelmed to allow the firefighters to do what they need to do on the field. And if I'm making decisions for the field, I can cause harm because I'm not there. I don't know what's going on. So I need to trust that they know what they're doing, and then their decisions, then it allows me to make decisions from there. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Did you go down to Florida for this last hurricane?
Yeah, I went to Hurricane Milton. So I went a couple days before Hurricane Milton hit. And the reason is because, well, they have a thing called EMAC, which is the Emergency Management Assistance Compact. And it's really just governor to governor mutual aid. So one governor asks another governor for assistance. So we went to provide kind of a force multiplier for their staff in their emergency operations centers. So we went before the hurricane, we got embedded with the local jurisdiction, and then the hurricane came through, and then we were able to start working with them to provide whatever help they needed to for their community.
Okay. Did you see any examples of the collateral beauty in kind of the aftermath of the Florida hurricane?
Well, yeah, I see that in an emergency operations center all the time. When you see people who have never worked together before, who get together and they start at first, everything's very tense and it's very stressful, especially when the hurricane's coming. You don't know what the impacts are going to be. And when you get through that, there's a point in every disaster that I love, which is when you see the temperature of the room kind of go down. People start to see that things are going to be okay. Their systems are working. They're all working together and they're making things happen. And you start to see that people feel okay with that. And then they start to laugh. They start to have a little bit of fun with each other. And you develop those relationships that then last really for a long time. So that's, I think, the collateral beauty that I saw when I was down there is just, we were working for a jurisdiction we had never seen before. They have different processes than we do. But by the end of it, we were all having fun together and we learned something from them. They learned something from us. It was a good time.
That's really cool. That's pretty interesting that these groups can come together and actually work well together. I think that speaks to the good leadership by people like yourself, that they can actually collaborate well together. I feel like there's so many examples where that just doesn't work and people's personalities don't mesh. So I think that speaks volumes when these teams can actually come together and collaborate well.
Yeah, you can't come in too rigid and you can't come in thinking that there's only one way of doing things. You have to just be kind of like, okay, how do you do things here? And then you can offer suggestions here and there, but it's definitely learning back and forth. Like we took some stuff home to say, hey, there's a couple things that we could build in our program that would be really good.
That's cool. Well, Lori, I really appreciate your time coming on the show. And thank you for taking the time to share your story and your experience with EMS with everyone. I think it's a great read for anyone that's struggling in EMS, trying to figure out the rhythm or the reason behind all these crazy things that we see and deal with. And I'm an avid reader, so I love books, and your book was a pleasure to pick up and read. It's beautifully done. It's very well written. It's a good work of art, and so I'm definitely going to recommend it to people, and I think there needs to be more books like that. So I really appreciate that you took the time to sit down and write this book, because writing a book is not easy, and it's great. So again, guys, the book is Shaking in the Forest, Finding Light in the Darkness by Lori Hodges. Do you have an Instagram or anything where people can find you?
I do have a website, lorihodges.com. pretty easy website. And then I am on LinkedIn probably more than any other social media that I'm on. But I would say to what you just said, well, thank you for all the kind comments about the book. But I also do think everybody has a story to tell. So I do think more people should really tell their stories and look up those memories from when they worked that call or whatever. So I definitely encourage that.
Yeah. Any other closing comments you want to make before we kind of sign off?
No, I think that was it. I just really thank you for having me on this podcast. Appreciate it.
Yeah. Thank you so much for your time. I appreciate it as well.